What if a man could commit murder repeatedly, time and time again, right under the noses of friends, neighbors, and everyone around him without anyone suspecting? What if the warning signs were ignored, dismissed outright, or even completely overlooked by the very people sworn to protect and serve the public? And what if stopping him required only one person to truly notice something unusual, to speak up about it, or to take decisive action, just once? Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a city of close-knit neighborhoods where children played freely on quiet streets, shopkeepers waved to familiar faces every day, and apartment buildings housed the ordinary lives of working families. A city that, on the surface, seemed completely safe, deeply familiar, and entirely predictable in its daily routines. But beneath that calm surface, something profoundly dark was stirring, hidden in plain sight, unnoticed by most, unchallenged entirely, and growing steadily over a full decade. This is the true story of Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer, a man whose unassuming, everyday exterior masked a deeply disturbing and horrifying inner world. Born in 1960 in Milwaukee, Dahmer grew up as an only child in a seemingly ordinary middle-class family environment. But even early on, there were clear signs of deep isolation, strange and odd behavior, and a growing fascination with the darker, more macabre aspects of life and death. As a teenager in high school, he began to experiment heavily with alcohol and exhibited disturbing impulses and fantasies that would later escalate into something truly unimaginable. By the late 1970s, Dahmer had crossed the irreversible line from private obsession to outright criminal action, committing his first brutal murder shortly after high school graduation. But it was specifically in Milwaukee during the 1980s that his crimes would intensify dramatically, following a chilling, repetitive pattern that law enforcement would fail to uncover or connect for many years. Over the course of more than a decade, Dahmer preyed relentlessly on 17 young men and boys, luring them one by one. Many of his victims were from marginalized communities, specifically men of color, recent immigrants, and those living precariously on the very edges of society. These were beloved sons, devoted brothers, close friends, and cherished lovers. Real people whose sudden disappearances might have been tragically overlooked by a world too quick to ignore or forget them. The victims did not vanish into mysterious, remote forests or long-forgotten abandoned buildings far from civilization. Instead, many disappeared right from busy streets, crowded bars, and lively social spaces in the very heart of the city. And the person responsible? A man whom neighbors consistently described as quiet, polite, and completely unremarkable in every way. A man who smiled politely at everyone, who chatted casually with passers-by on the street, and who could live entirely in plain sight without ever raising the slightest suspicion. The setting of these horrific crimes was not some shadowy, isolated warehouse or a secret underground bunker. It was an ordinary apartment complex right in Milwaukee, a place where everyday people called home, a building filled with tenants who came and went daily, who might have noticed a strange, foul smell, a missing neighbor, or something inexplicably off, but who never managed to piece it all together. It was, in the most terrifying and chilling sense, completely and utterly ordinary. And the warning signs? They were right there all along. Multiple encounters with law enforcement for minor offenses that should have raised red flags. Disturbing behaviors repeatedly reported directly to authorities. Friends and neighbors who felt deeply uneasy but did not fully understand or act on their instincts. Time and again, these critical warnings were ignored or downplayed, representing missed opportunities that would later haunt investigators, detectives, and shattered families alike. This is not just a story about one isolated killer and his actions. It is a story of countless missed chances, profound systemic failure within institutions, and the devastating human cost of collective silence and inaction. It is the heartbreaking story of lives cut brutally short, of families left forever searching for answers and closure, and of an entire city forced to confront a truth too disturbing and horrifying to ignore any longer. And it raises a haunting question that still echoes powerfully decades later. How was he allowed to keep going, unchecked for so long? Because sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not cleverly hidden away. Sometimes they are simply unseen, blending seamlessly into everyday life.
What drives a man to take a life, and then another, and another? At what point does fascination with death become obsession, and obsession become murder? Jeffrey Dahmer's story did not begin in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It began quietly, almost unnoticed, in Ohio. It was in the aftermath of high school, in the fragile years of early adulthood, in the shadows of a life searching for control, acceptance, and belonging. In 1978, just weeks after graduating from high school, Dahmer picked up his first victim, a young hitchhiker, a stranger. Someone with a life that, to the world, mattered deeply, but who would vanish without a trace. There were no witnesses, no arrests, no suspects. The crime disappeared into the shadows, unrecorded by newspapers, unmarked by police logs, almost as if it had never happened. For nearly a decade after that first killing, Dahmer's life seemed outwardly unremarkable. Yet beneath the surface, a dangerous compulsion was brewing. He struggled with alcohol, an addiction that both isolated him and lowered his inhibitions. He dropped out of college, unable to sustain focus or form meaningful social connections. Employment was sporadic. He drifted from job to job, apartment to apartment, always seeking stability, but never truly finding it. For a time, he lived with his grandmother, appearing to lead a normal life. But all the while, the urge to kill persisted. By the mid-1980s, Dahmer's behavior escalated. Arrest for indecent exposure and public misbehavior brought him briefly to the attention of law enforcement. These were small warnings that, had they been followed up more thoroughly, might have changed the course of many lives. But authorities did not probe deeply. The crimes remained hidden, quiet, private, and insidious. In 1987, Dahmer moved to Milwaukee, a city that would become the center of his spree. With each new move, the killings became more brazen and frequent. The pattern that would define his crimes began to emerge. He would seek out young men in public spaces, bars, bus stops, and downtown streets, often targeting those on the fringes of society, men of color, immigrants, and those struggling with homelessness or addiction. Dahmer would offer money, alcohol, or companionship to lure them in, creating a false sense of trust. Once isolated, he would bring victims to his apartment, a place that seemed ordinary to the outside world, yet harbored unimaginable horrors inside.
Over the next 4 years, a chilling rhythm developed. Victims vanished without a trace, their families searching in vain for answers, their disappearances dismissed or overlooked.
Some of Dahmer's early Milwaukee victims included Stephen Hicks, Stephen Twomey, and others, young men whose stories were never fully told because they were never found, their lives swallowed by silence. Yet each disappearance, each life taken, marked an escalation, a man becoming bolder, more confident, and more reckless. And then came 1991, the year everything changed. A moment of carelessness. A man Dahmer had lured, a man who would escape the apartment alive. Bleeding, terrified, and desperate, he ran into the streets and flagged down police. His story was almost unbelievable, a confession in motion, a living witness to the horror. Officers followed him back to Dahmer's apartment. What they discovered there would shock the nation, revealing decades of unspeakable acts. The building, the very heart of ordinary Milwaukee life, concealed evidence of crimes so unimaginable that journalists, investigators, and neighbors alike struggled to comprehend the scale of Dahmer's actions. For more than a decade, a serial killer had operated in plain sight, exploiting societal blind spots, missed warnings, and a system that too often overlooked the vulnerable. And it all came to light in one moment, a man's desperate flight for survival. The timeline of Dahmer's crimes is not just a list of events. It is a portrait of unchecked compulsion, societal neglect, and the consequences of silence. From Ohio to Milwaukee, from his first murder to his eventual capture, the timeline shows the escalation, the pattern, and the failures that allowed one man to continue killing for years. A terrifying lesson in vigilance and the cost of inaction. And it was this timeline, these missing years, these vanished men, these ignored signals, that would form the backbone of the investigation that would finally bring Dahmer to justice. But before the world could understand who Jeffrey Dahmer really was, investigators had to piece together a puzzle made of fear, disappearance, and tragedy. And that is where the investigation begins. How do you uncover a decade of murder hiding in plain sight, concealed behind a facade of normalcy? How does an ordinary apartment become the epicenter of one of the most notorious criminal investigations in history, a place where unimaginable horrors unfolded? When Milwaukee police first arrived at Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment in 1991, they were responding to what seemed like a routine report. A man had escaped an attacker, and the officers expected a simple domestic disturbance or perhaps an assault, a common call in any city. They were utterly unprepared for the unspeakable horrors they were about to discover within the seemingly ordinary walls of apartment 213. Inside apartment 213 of the Oxford Apartments, officers were immediately struck by an odd, pervasive smell. It was a persistent, sickly odor that seemed entirely out of place in a typical residential building, a stench that hinted at something deeply disturbing. The air was heavy, almost unbearable, and hints of something far darker lingered beneath the surface of the apartment's unsettling atmosphere. Containers lined the shelves, filled with substances that were unusual and alarming, their contents a mystery that would soon be horrifyingly revealed. Objects that didn't belong to a single person were scattered throughout the apartment, a collection suggesting secrecy, meticulous preparation, and chilling concealment. Then came the photographic evidence, a discovery that would prove pivotal in unraveling the full scope of Dahmer's depravity. Investigators discovered hundreds of photographs depicting young men in various poses, a chilling archive of his victims. At first, the images were cryptic, perhaps even artistic to an untrained eye, their true horror not immediately apparent. But as detectives examined them more closely, a horrifying pattern emerged, connecting these images to a much larger, darker narrative. Many of the photographs appeared to be linked to missing persons reports, each frame capturing someone who had vanished under mysterious circumstances. Federal authorities were soon notified, recognizing the escalating gravity and complexity of the case. The FBI joined local investigators, bringing forensic expertise, extensive experience in serial crimes, and the ability to analyze decades of patterns. Missing persons reports from Milwaukee and beyond were reopened, some dating back years, revealing a chilling backlog of unsolved cases. Investigators began to see a vast web of disappearances that, until that moment, had seemed isolated and unrelated, now tragically connected. But the investigation revealed something even more chilling. The police had encountered Dahmer before, a fact that would haunt the department. One of the most criticized incidents occurred when officers returned a distressed young man to Dahmer after noticing suspicious circumstances. Dahmer's calm demeanor, coupled with his feigned politeness, convinced the officers that no crime had been committed, a fatal misjudgment. The victim was sent back into Dahmer's control, and for years, that decision haunted the Milwaukee Police Department, a stark reminder of a missed opportunity. It was a glaring example of how a killer could exploit trust, societal bias, and human error to continue his crimes unchecked, hidden in plain sight. With the evidence mounting, investigators intensified their efforts, driven by the horrifying revelations. Interviews were conducted with Dahmer, beginning as preliminary questioning, but escalating rapidly as patterns and evidence became undeniable. The interviews revealed a man who was startlingly articulate, calm, and disturbingly detailed in his recollections, a chilling composure. Yet beneath the surface of his polite demeanor lay a mind consumed by obsession and compulsion, a dark abyss of human depravity. Dahmer confessed, not to one murder, not to a single act of violence, but to 17 murders spanning more than a decade, a confession that shocked the world. Detectives learned about his methods, how he lured victims to his apartment, the tools and preparations he used, and the horrifying logic he applied to evade detection. Each confession added clarity to the timeline of missing persons, filling in gaps that families had long struggled to comprehend, bringing a grim closure.
Investigators meticulously cataloged the evidence, photographs, personal belongings, and the contents of Dahmer's apartment, every item a piece of the puzzle.
Every object told a story, linking Dahmer directly to victims who had once seemed to vanish without explanation, now tragically accounted for. The apartment, ordinary in appearance, had become a treasure trove of forensic proof, a place where every corner, every drawer, Every container contained the key to unraveling a decade of crimes. Patterns emerged: victim selection, timing, lures, and tactics, all meticulously recorded by detectives, revealing a chilling methodology. The authorities realized the scale of the failure that had allowed Dahmer to continue undetected, missed tips, ignored reports, and assumptions about who the victims were. Many of Dahmer's victims came from marginalized communities, people society had overlooked, and that oversight had been his shield, enabling his horrific acts. The investigation also prompted psychological profiling. Experts began to study Dahmer's motivations, his history, and his interactions with victims. They tried to understand the mind of a killer who could operate so long without being caught, a chilling enigma. But the turning point, the moment the world understood the magnitude of Dahmer's crimes, was his confession, a stark revelation. In calm, chilling detail, he revealed the scope, method, and rationale behind his murders, leaving no room for doubt. The evidence aligned perfectly with his admissions, solidifying the case against him beyond any question. The case that began with a single escaped victim had transformed into one of the most notorious serial murder investigations in American history, a dark chapter. And yet, even as investigators pieced together the evidence, a disturbing truth emerged. Dahmer's crimes could have been stopped long before 1991.
Every interaction, every arrest, every warning that went unheeded became part of the narrative. A story of missed chances and a society unprepared to recognize the signs of a monster in their midst.
The investigation would not only uncover the horrors of his apartment, but it would also force Milwaukee and the nation to confront uncomfortable questions about vigilance, bias, and the consequences of ignoring warning signs. The investigation had revealed the full extent of Dahmer's crimes, but understanding the man behind them, the suspect, his motives, and his twisted psyche, was the next profound challenge.
What kind of person can commit unthinkable crimes and still seem ordinary? How does a man capable of extreme violence blend so seamlessly into everyday life? And when he finally confesses, is he a monster driven by madness, or a man who knew exactly what he was doing? Jeffrey Dahmer did not fit the image people expected. He wasn't loud, aggressive, or threatening. He was quiet, soft-spoken, and emotionally distant. He was more likely to be remembered as awkward than dangerous, a man who kept to himself and rarely stood out. And that was precisely what made him so difficult to detect. To neighbors, Dahmer was just another tenant. To co-workers, he was withdrawn but polite. To bartenders and acquaintances, he was quiet, sometimes lonely, a man searching for connection. No one suspected that behind this subdued exterior lived a deeply fractured inner world. After his arrest, psychologists and psychiatrists were tasked with answering the most critical question of all: who was Jeffrey Dahmer and why did he kill? Their findings painted a complex and disturbing picture. Dahmer suffered from severe alcoholism, a dependency that began in his teenage years and followed him throughout adulthood. Alcohol was not just a habit, it was a coping mechanism, a way to silence intrusive thoughts and suppress impulses he could not control. But it also lowered his inhibitions, allowing those impulses to surface. He experienced chronic isolation. From an early age, Dahmer struggled to form emotional connections. Relationships were fleeting, friendships shallow, and intimacy felt unreachable. This isolation deepened over time, feeding a sense of detachment from others and from social norms. Perhaps most revealing was his intense fear of abandonment. Dahmer later told investigators that his actions were not driven by anger or hatred toward his victims. Instead, he claimed he was motivated by a desperate desire to prevent people from leaving him. In his mind, control equaled connection. If someone could not leave, they could not abandon him. This was not rage. It was obsession. Experts described Dahmer's motive as rooted in possession and control, not impulsive violence. His crimes were methodical, planned, and repetitive, a ritual that gave him a sense of stability in an otherwise empty life. Each act reinforced the illusion that he could create companionship on his own terms. But this explanation raised uncomfortable questions. If Dahmer knew what he was doing, if he planned his actions, if he took steps to avoid detection, then was he insane or simply calculating? Psychiatrists were divided. Some argued that Dahmer suffered from profound mental disorders that impaired his ability to resist his urges. They pointed to his compulsive behavior, emotional detachment, and inability to regulate impulses as signs of severe psychological disturbance. Others disagreed. They noted that Dahmer understood right from wrong, that he took deliberate steps to conceal evidence, and that he adjusted his behavior when he felt at risk of being caught. These actions suggested awareness, not delusion. The debate centered on one critical issue: legal sanity. In the eyes of the law, being mentally ill does not automatically excuse criminal behavior. The question was not whether Dahmer was disturbed, but whether he was capable of understanding the consequences of his actions and choosing to commit them anyway. As investigators reviewed his confessions, a chilling pattern emerged. Dahmer spoke calmly. He remembered details. He corrected investigators when they misunderstood facts. There was no confusion, no break from reality. He was not disconnected from what he had done. He was fully aware. The suspect was no longer a mystery. Jeffrey Dahmer was not a man who snapped. He was not driven by sudden rage. He was not out of control in the moments that mattered most. He was a man who planned. And that realization would shape everything that followed. Because the court would soon be forced to answer the question the public was already asking. Was Jeffrey Dahmer a mentally ill man who could not stop, or a calculating killer who chose not to? The answer would not only determine his fate, it would define how justice would be served. And in a courtroom filled with grieving families, that decision was about to be made.
What happens when a man confesses to unimaginable crimes with chilling calm? When evidence overwhelms but the mind is disturbed, how does justice proceed? Justice decides what happened and the suspect's nature amid depravity. By July 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer's secrecy ended abruptly. Tracy Edwards' desperate escape from Dahmer triggered a major arrest. Edwards' flight revealed apartment horrors to police. Milwaukee police took Dahmer into custody without resistance. He did not run, deny, or fight. He complied passively. This compliance hinted at a disturbing psychology. Soon, the case's depravity magnitude unfolded. Investigators linked apartment evidence to missing persons reports. Charges grew rapidly, spanning over a decade. Each charge a tragically lost life. Each name a family awaiting answers. Dahmer accused of multiple murders, a major U.S. case. Milwaukee stunned by long undetected atrocities. National media swarmed the courthouse in shock. News questioned undetected crimes and systemic failures. Families learned horrific fates behind headlines. In 1992, the trial began. Courtroom became a place of reckoning. Dahmer pled not guilty by insanity, dividing opinion. Many saw it as escaping responsibility. Others questioned mental illness and legal limits. Prosecution proved Dahmer understood and chose his acts. Defense claimed his mental state prevented control. Victims' families filled the courtroom for answers. They heard gruesome details near Dahmer. Psychiatrists testified on his mental state. Some described disorders, detachment, compulsions, obsession, dependency, fractured relationships. Others said he was aware and rational. Prosecutors showed planning, concealment, awareness. Dahmer knew right from wrong, adjusted under threat. Jury weighed arguments carefully, reviewed evidence, testimony, insanity distinction. Was Dahmer incapable or ignoring consequences? After weeks, jury reached a verdict. Rejected insanity, held him responsible. Guilty on all counts. Silent courtroom as verdict read. Accountability for families, though not closure. Sentenced to life terms, no parole. Judge, his terror over, life behind bars. Legally, justice served. Questions lingered beyond courtroom. How so long? Warnings ignored? Lives savable? Sparked talk on failures, bias, responsibility. Consequences felt for generations. Conviction ends case, not the past. Dahmer's story continues to resonate.
What happens after a monster is locked away? Does justice end the story, or does it only begin a deeper reckoning? And when the man at the center of the horror is silenced forever, what truths are lost with him? Jeffrey Dahmer would spend just 2 years in prison. After receiving multiple life sentences in 1992, he was transferred into the Wisconsin prison system, where he lived among other inmates. He was no longer a mystery to investigators, no longer a suspect, but a convicted serial killer who whose name had become synonymous with horror. Then, in 1994, the story took an unexpected turn. Jeffrey Dahmer was killed by another inmate while incarcerated. The news spread quickly. For some, his death felt like justice, a final consequence delivered outside the courtroom. For others, it felt deeply unsettling. Dahmer died without ever fully answering every question investigators still had. Interviews were unfinished. Psychological studies were incomplete. The opportunity to understand how such a man operated undetected for so long was suddenly gone. His death did not bring closure. Instead, it reopened wounds. As the public processed the end of Dahmer's life, attention shifted back to the people whose lives had been taken, the victims whose names had been overshadowed by the killer who took them. They were sons, brothers, friends, human beings with futures that never arrived. Many came from marginalized communities, people whose disappearances were not immediately treated as urgent. Families who reported missing loved ones were sometimes met with indifference, delay, or dismissal. And that reality became one of the most disturbing revelations of the entire case. In the months and years following the trial, Milwaukee faced public outrage. Investigations and internal reviews exposed a series of systemic failures. These included missed warnings, including prior arrests and disturbing encounters that were never fully investigated. There was institutional bias, where assumptions about victims influenced how seriously reports were taken, and failures to protect vulnerable communities, allowing a predator to exploit those least likely to be heard. Perhaps the most painful realization was that Dahmer had come into contact with police multiple times before his arrest. Each encounter represented a potential turning point, a moment when the trajectory of this story could have changed. But it didn't. The case forced law enforcement agencies nationwide to confront uncomfortable truths about policing, accountability, and the consequences of ignoring warning signs. As a result, police policies were reviewed and reformed. Training protocols were updated. Emphasis was placed on handling missing persons cases more thoroughly and treating all victims with equal urgency. But reform came too late for the families who had already lost everything. For them, justice felt incomplete. No sentence could restore what was taken. No policy change could rewrite the past. What remained was grief, layered with anger, confusion, and unanswered questions. Families were left asking the same haunting question. If someone had listened sooner, how many lives could have been saved? That question echoes far beyond Milwaukee. Because the Dahmer case is not just about one man. It is about systems that failed, voices that went unheard, and the devastating cost of indifference. The most terrifying truth is not simply that monsters exist. It is that sometimes they are ignored, they are excused, they are underestimated. And by the time they are finally seen, it is already too late. This case remains a warning, a reminder that vigilance matters, that empathy matters, that listening can save lives. And as the final chapter closes, the legacy of this story does not belong to the killer. It belongs to the victims. Their lives mattered, their stories matter, and they deserve to be remembered, not as footnotes in a criminal case, but as people whose absence changed the world forever. If you found this case compelling and want to follow more real investigations, courtroom moments, and true crime breakdowns, feel free to subscribe to the channel. Your likes, comments, and turning on the notification bell help you stay updated whenever we release a new story. Share your thoughts below. We'd love to hear your perspective.